I'm Commander Vincent Woodard, Chief of Planetary Security and former head of the Red Devils program here on Mars.
Humanity tells itself a story about its expansion into the stars. Clean, forward-facing, lit with purpose. The story begins with a bold step, a first breath of pressurized air on alien ground, a flag, or a handshake, or a name carved into rock. It begins with intention. Cydonia does not fit that story, not because it was a failure, not because the people who built it weren't brave or determined or willing to endure things that would break most of us, but because the story humanity tells about its first permanent step beyond Earth leaves out the most important detail, that the first colony wasn't built to explore or to expand consciousness or to reach toward something greater. It was built to dig. We tend to look at Cydonia and see a beginning, a cradle, the origin point of everything that came after, the settled systems, the United Colonies, the long, slow spread of human civilization across dozens of star systems. And it is all of those things. But it is also something quieter and stranger than any of those labels suggest. Cydonia is the place where humanity first discovered what it actually cost to survive somewhere it was never supposed to exist. That distinction matters more than it might seem, because there's a difference between the cost of going somewhere and the cost of staying. The first people who stepped onto Martian soil faced the former. The people who built tunnels beneath it, who spent their lives breathing recycled air and watching their knuckles crack from the cold and the dryness and the relentless work. They faced the latter. And the world those people built, and the world that outlasted them, tells a different story about human ambition than the one we prefer. So the question isn't whether Cydonia was humanity's first great step forward. The question is what that step actually revealed about who we are when the distance between us and survival gets very, very small. Mars was the obvious choice, and like most obvious choices, it carried hidden costs that only became apparent after the commitment was made. It was close, cosmically speaking, close enough that communications weren't purely theoretical, close enough that emergency resupply wasn't a decade away, close enough that corporate management back on Earth could maintain meaningful oversight. That oversight mattered enormously to the early planners. They weren't sending workers into the dark and wishing them well. They were extending a chain of control across the void, and they needed the links in that chain to hold. The company behind that chain was Deimos Staryards Incorporated, a shipbuilding corporation that understood, perhaps better than anyone in the early 22nd century, that building ships required metal, and that the mineral deposits on Mars were something the exhausted geology of Earth could no longer easily match. When Deimos Staryards founded the colony of Cydonia in 2112, they weren't making a philosophical statement about humanity's destiny. They were solving a supply problem. Iron ore, accessible and extractable, was what they needed. And the Martian subsurface had it in quantities that made the considerable logistics of planetary settlement seem, if not easy, at least defensible as a business case. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The first permanent human settlement beyond Earth was a corporate mining venture, not an act of exploration, not a declaration of civilization, not a flag planted for posterity. A supply chain extended into space. The Cydonia region of Mars, set in the planet's ancient northern lowlands, terrain shaped by billions of years of geological process, was identified early as the most viable site for permanent settlement. Not because it was comfortable. Mars is not comfortable anywhere. But because the mineral deposits were accessible, the terrain was manageable, and the ancient compressed rock offered something that would become essential to the design of the colony: material solid enough to be hollowed out and turned into shelter. What the early planners of Deimos Staryards understood, and what often gets omitted from the commemorative language about Cydonia's founding, is that the colony was never intended to be self-sustaining in any meaningful cultural sense. It was intended to be productive. The distinction is fine but crucial. A self-sustaining settlement builds for its own future. A productive outpost builds for someone else's present. Cydonia had one primary deliverable from its very first day: consistent extraction at acceptable cost, shipped reliably back to wherever the metal was needed most. Everything else, the human lives required to accomplish this, the social fabric necessary to sustain those lives, the institutions and traditions that would inevitably emerge from people sharing difficult conditions over time. These were operational considerations, not goals. The United Colonies, which would not formally exist until 2159, nearly half a century after Cydonia's founding, would eventually inherit all of this. They would inherit the colony, the supply chain, and the complicated human cost of both. But that came later. In the beginning, it was simpler, and in some ways starker. A corporation needed metal, a planet had it, and the people willing to go and get it would be provided just enough to make that possible. Cydonia was not dropped onto the surface of Mars like a seed, it was burrowed into it. This is the first thing to understand about the colony's character, because it shaped everything that followed. The people who came to Cydonia did not build outward, the way you might imagine a pioneer settlement sprawling across open land. They built inward and downward, tunneling through rock and establishing their presence not on top of Mars, but inside it. The surface structures, the dome that became the colony's iconic face, the airlocks and landing pads and the external equipment that speaks to any approaching ship. These are the skin of Cydonia. The bones are underground. There is something philosophically interesting about a civilization whose first act was to go below ground. Every instinct we have about expansion and exploration is oriented upward and outward. We look at the sky when we dream, and yet the first humans to permanently leave Earth spent their days going deeper into rock, breathing air they had manufactured, eating food grown under artificial light, living in the dark space of a world that had never asked for them. You can read this as defeat, if you want to, as humanity scaling down its ambitions to match what was actually survivable. But I think it's more honest to read it as the first real lesson the settled systems ever learned, that surviving somewhere new requires you to adapt to it, not the other way around. The rock doesn't care what you dreamed of on the journey out. The rock is what it is. You work with it or you don't last. The early colonists lasted. What makes that fact remarkable isn't the dramatic dimension of it. though the conditions were dramatic enough, in the particular quiet way that slow attrition is always more dramatic than sudden catastrophe. What makes it remarkable is how much of their survival depended on mundane competence. The people who kept Cydonia alive in its first years were not explorers in any romantic sense. They were engineers, life support technicians, medical workers, cooks, systems operators, people whose relationship to the frontier was almost entirely practical. People who had no use for the mythology being written about them back on Earth while they were busy keeping the oxygen recyclers running. In the beginning, Cydonia was less a colony and more a pressurized outpost, a cluster of people whose primary function was to prove that the concept was viable. The infrastructure was skeletal. The population was small enough that everyone knew everyone, which was a comfort and a burden in equal measure. Every system failure was personal. Every death, and there were deaths, was felt by everyone who shared the same recycled air. What they were mining in those early years wasn't iron exactly. It was proof. Proof that humans could work on Mars. Proof that the logistics could function at the distances involved. Proof that the economics of colonial resource extraction could be made to pencil out in the long run, which required swallowing significant short-term losses, that the funding institutions back on Earth had to be continuously reminded were temporary. But the iron ore was always the point. Even in those earliest, most precarious years, the mining operations were the reason Cydonia existed. Every other aspect of colony life, the housing, the food production, the medical facilities, the social spaces, existed in service of keeping the miners functional. The colony was not a community that happened to mine. It was a mine that required a community to function. That distinction seeped into the identity of the place over time. It shaped the kind of people who came, the kind who stayed, and the relationship Cydonia would eventually develop with the institutions that claimed authority over it. Iron ore is not a glamorous resource. It doesn't have the mystery of helium-3 or the political weight of titanium. It's iron, ancient, heavy, fundamental, unglamorous, the kind of material that goes into everything and gets credit for nothing. The mining operations at Cydonia were built around this basic material reality. The ore veins ran deep into the Martian subsurface, which meant the work was physical, technical, and unforgiving. The equipment needed for large-scale extraction in low gravity and near vacuum conditions had to be engineered from scratch. There were no existing blueprints for Mars-adapted heavy mining equipment because no one had ever built any. The early engineers improvised, failed, redesigned, failed again, and eventually arrived at solutions that worked just well enough to be worth building on. What came out of the ground made its way to processing facilities within the colony's lower levels, and from there to bulk freighters bound for the Deimos Staryard orbiting Mars's moon, where the ore would be fed into the production of warships for what would eventually become the UC Navy. The economics only worked because of scale. Small quantities of ore from Mars were not worth the shipping costs, but large quantities, consistently extracted, consistently shipped, maintained by a colony that kept its overhead low enough to preserve thin margins. That could be made to work. Barely, but work. And that barely is significant. It defined the material conditions of life in Cydonia for generations, shaping the relationship between the people who did the extracting and the institutions that received what they extracted. The colony received what it needed from the United Colonies, which had coalesced as a governing and administrative authority with a clarity of purpose that, in its early decades, still felt something like genuine civic aspiration. But it received little more. The infrastructure that supported the colony's population was adequate, not generous. The housing was functional. The medical facilities could handle what they could handle and transferred the rest off-world when possible. The food supply combined local hydroponic production with imported provisions in a balance that satisfied caloric requirements more reliably than it satisfied anything else. This was not cruelty on the part of the UC, or not only cruelty, it was the mathematics of a colonial venture at the edge of economic viability. Resources allocated to Cydonian quality of life were resources not available for expanding production or improving margins or funding the next phase of colonial development elsewhere. The colony was always being asked to fund its own successor, which is a particular kind of sacrifice, working toward a future you will never see, contributing to a story in which you are not the protagonist. The miners understood this in the way that people always understand the nature of their situation without needing it explained to them. The gap between what Cydonia produced and what Cydonia received back was legible in the state of the corridors, in the quality of the equipment that was maintained rather than replaced, in the way administrative attention moved through the colony like a beam of light through murky water, present in principle, functionally absent in practice. And yet, the mining continued. This matters. It would be easy to frame Cydonian history as a story of exploitation met with resentment, and that element is real. But the fuller picture is more complicated. The people who came to work the Martian mines were, by and large, people who had made a calculation. Life on Earth in the period of early colonial expansion was not easy for most people. The populations of a crowded, resource-strained planet did not all have equal access to whatever comfort and stability existed. The mines of Cydonia offered wages, however modest. They offered housing, however functional. They offered a distance from the particular pressures and humiliations of Earth's lower economic strata. That was itself a form of value. Cydonia was not chosen. It was settled for by people who understood that their options were limited, and who chose the option that pointed away from something rather than toward it. That is a different kind of ambition than the heroic sort. It is quieter and more honest, and it produced a culture that was harder and more self-reliant and less interested in grand narratives than the official story of humanity's expansion preferred. The people who stayed in Cydonia, who worked the mines for a decade and then stayed, who raised children in the tunnels and the pressurized corridors and the narrow living quarters, were not there by accident. They had been shaped by the place. Mars had gotten into them in some way that was difficult to articulate, but immediately recognizable to anyone else who had been shaped the same way. A directness, a skepticism of comfort, a specific kind of patience that doesn't look like patience until you've been in a situation where it was the only tool available. A culture had formed. No one planned it. No administrator in the UC's early colonial governance structure had written a document about the desired cultural outcomes of Martian settlement. But cultures emerge from conditions, not from intentions. And the conditions of Cydonia were specific enough that the culture they produced was specific too. The physical environment of Cydonia is not incidental to understanding it. The colony's character is inseparable from what it feels like to exist inside it. The approach from orbit tells you relatively little. Mars below looks vast and barren and ancient in the way that only geological time produces, the kind of age that makes human ambition seem brief and faintly absurd. The surface in the Cydonia region is marked by the equipment and infrastructure of centuries of mining activity. Roads cut into rock, ventilation structures rising from the ground like strange plants, the occasional flash of a solar panel array catching light. And then the dome, which is Cydonia's face to the sky, a pressurized canopy above the central hub, weathered by dust storms and ultraviolet radiation and the slow grinding of Martian seasons. Walking in through the airlock is a transition more abrupt than most. The outside is silence and cold, and a sky that is the wrong shade of everything. Inside is noise, warmth, the smell of recycled air that carries in it the trace signatures of decades of human habitation, cooking smells, machine oil, the particular dustiness of rock that has been cut and ground and moved around for a very long time. The central hub of Cydonia is not large by the standards of anywhere else, but it feels functional in a way that slightly larger places sometimes don't. Every surface is in use. Every space has been claimed for something. The broken spear sits in the hub like a spine, the bar and gathering place that serves as the colony's informal center of gravity. Bars in working settlements like this one are not primarily about drinking. They are about the particular human need to exist in a shared space, to hear other voices that aren't filtered through a comm system, to remember that there are other people in here with you. The broken spear is where news travels, where disputes get raised and sometimes resolved, where the texture of daily Cydonian life accumulates over years into something that functions as collective memory. The residential areas are below the hub, carved into the rock in a layout that expanded organically over generations rather than being planned from the start. The corridors have that particular narrowness of underground spaces that weren't designed for wide-bodied comfort, but for efficient movement between places where work happens. Doors are heavy. Ceilings are lower than anything you'd build if you had space to spare. The walls are often bare rock, sometimes paneled, occasionally decorated with things that people brought from elsewhere or made themselves. What's most striking about moving through Cydonia is how ordinary it manages to be. This is not a sleek vision of the future. It is a place where people have lived for a very long time and have arranged that living with the pragmatism of people who understand that they are not going anywhere else. The ordinariness is not a failure of imagination. It is what a colony looks like when it survives long enough to stop being an experiment. There are children who were born here, grew up here, know Mars as home in the way that people know home, not as a concept, but as a texture, a smell, a set of roots between places, a cluster of people and routines that together constitute the world. For them, Earth is the abstract thing. Mars is real. This is a transformation that doesn't get enough attention in the histories. At some point, a colony stops being an extension of the place that created it and becomes its own origin. The exact moment is impossible to identify. It doesn't happen at a ceremony or get recorded in an official document. It happens in the way things always happen when they matter, slowly and then all at once, and by the time anyone notices, it's already been true for a while. Cydonia stopped being an Earth colony at some point in its early history and became a Martian one. The distinction is not trivial. It changed what the people there wanted, what they expected, and how they understood their relationship to the institutions that claimed authority over them. The United Colonies did not relinquish authority over Cydonia when that shift happened. This was, in retrospect, a decision with very long consequences. It's worth remembering the sequence here. Cydonia existed for nearly 50 years before the UC was formally established in 2159. The colony was not a creation of UC policy. It predated the UC entirely, founded by Deimos Staryards for corporate purposes that had nothing to do with political governance. What the UC did when it came into being and began extending its administrative reach through the Sol system was absorb a colony that was already old, already shaped by its own conditions, already developing its own culture. Based on what we know of how the UC operated, it's reasonable to assume that this absorption was framed as protection and legitimacy rather than acquisition, the language of order and stability that institutions always use when they are in the process of extending control. Whether the people of Cydonia experienced it that way is a different question. The administrative structure of the UC's colonial governance was built for populations that the UC had helped create. It was not well calibrated for a community that had already been surviving on its own terms for decades before anyone in New Atlantis had any say in the matter. The framework was paternalistic in the benign sense, attentive to practical outcomes, interested in stability and productivity, willing to invest in infrastructure when the mathematics justified it. But it was not designed to accommodate the emergence of genuinely distinct colonial identities with their own priorities and their own understanding of where authority legitimately rested. Cydonia was governed from above, formally by UC administrators who came with appointment documents and left with performance reports, and practically by the interplay between those administrators and the established power structures within the colony itself. The mine operators, the logistics coordinators, the people who had been there long enough to know where every pipe and cable ran. These were the people whose cooperation made the colony function, and they knew it. There was a negotiation always in progress between official authority and practical authority, conducted in the language of operational necessity rather than political philosophy, but a negotiation nonetheless. The UC, for its part, treated Cydonia with the particular kind of attention it gives things that are important but not beloved. The colony was embedded enough in the supply chains of the early settled systems that its disruption would have been genuinely costly. That gave it a certain protection. But protection from disruption is not the same as care, and the people of Cydonia understood the difference. They knew they were maintained rather than valued. They knew that the calculus involved in decisions about their colony began with output metrics and worked backward to human welfare rather than the reverse. What this produced was not rebellion, not in the early periods, not in any organized sense. It produced something subtler and in some ways more durable, a deep, ambient skepticism of institutional good intentions. The kind of skepticism that doesn't announce itself, but structures every interaction between Cydonian citizens and UC authority. A flatness in the eyes of people who have heard official language before and have learned to hold it at a remove from anything they would trust with their actual lives. This is not unique to Cydonia. It is the common inheritance of colonial populations throughout history, on Earth and beyond it. But Cydonia is interesting because it was the first. The patterns that would eventually define the relationship between the UC and its colonial populations, the cycles of extraction and resentment, the administrative distance that became cultural distance, the way official narratives diverged from lived experience until the gap was impossible to ignore. All of these played out at Cydonia first, in slower motion and with less dramatic consequence than they would elsewhere. But first, there were people within the UC's colonial administration who noticed this. Some of them wrote reports. The reports recommended better resource allocation, more responsive governance structures, investment in quality of life improvements that might close the gap between what Cydonia produced and what it received. Some of these recommendations were acted on partially. Some were filed and forgotten. The ones that were forgotten outnumbered the ones that weren't, in the way that institutional recommendations always do. The colony continued. Its productivity remained acceptable. The political situation remained stable. By the metrics that administrative systems tend to use, Cydonia was fine. The metrics that administrative systems tend to use are not always the right ones. The colony war arrived in Cydonia the way catastrophic things tend to arrive in places that have spent their existence managing smaller hardships, not all at once, but in a sequence of escalations that each felt individually survivable until the aggregate became something else. By 2038, the tension between the United Colonies and the Free Star Collective, a tension that had already produced one major war in the Nerion system nearly a century earlier, had collapsed into open conflict again. The Colony War, as it became known, ran from 2308 to 2311. 3 years that left marks on every significant population center in human space. Cydonia was not the primary theater of operations. The fiercest fighting happened elsewhere, on Nera, where whole swathes of the planet were reduced to scorched ruin, and in the space over Cheyenne, where the war would ultimately be decided. But Mars was not untouched. Lore preserved in settled systems records makes clear that Cydonia itself was targeted during the conflict, an attack that UC forces successfully repelled, sparing the colony from potential destruction. That the attack happened at all tells you something about Cydonia's strategic importance. You don't target something unless its loss would matter. But the colony war touched Cydonia in ways that don't show up in the operational histories. The colony was too embedded in UC supply chains not to be affected by the diversion of resources toward the war effort. Materials that would have gone to infrastructure maintenance went to military production. Personnel who would have come out on administrative assignments stayed home. The careful, inadequate balance of extraction and reinvestment that had kept the colony functional tilted further toward extraction and stayed there for the duration. The people of Cydonia were not asked whether they supported the war. The UC did not, in general, ask its colonial populations whether they supported things. This was noted. There was a particular bitterness to the wartime experience in Cydonia that had less to do with the war itself than with what the war made visible. The iron coming out of Martian rock was going into hulls and bulkheads, and the structural components of warships that would fight engagements the miners would never see. The colony was feeding a conflict it hadn't been consulted about, from resources that were supposed to belong to it in some distributed sense, toward outcomes that the UC's strategic planners had determined were worth the cost. Nobody in those planning rooms had asked a Cydonian miner to weigh in on the cost assessment. The production demands didn't decrease because there was a war on. If anything, they intensified. The UC needed more iron, not less, and Cydonia was one of the reliable sources. So, the work continued at pace, in conditions of reduced investment, with the deferred maintenance accumulating in ways that created cascading risks. A tunnel section shored up inadequately, life support components running past their effective service life, medical equipment not replaced on schedule. Nothing catastrophic most of the time. Enough near misses to keep the anxiety constant. What the wars also did, less materially but perhaps more lastingly, was clarify something that had been ambient in Cydonian consciousness for some time. The asymmetry of the relationship between the colony and the authority that claimed sovereignty over it. In ordinary times, this asymmetry was manageable. It was the condition of life, accepted the way you accept the background noise of a place you've lived in long enough to stop hearing it. In wartime, it became loud. The colony was contributing to something it had not chosen, in service of interests it had not been consulted about. At costs, it was absorbing without acknowledgement. Veterans of the colony war who passed through Cydonia, some on their way to assignments, some returning from them, some simply adrift in the aftermath, brought with them the particular quality of a tension that war leaves in people. A sharpness, an impatience with certain kinds of institutional language, an ability to look at a situation and see its actual structure rather than its official description. In a place that had always been skeptical of official descriptions, these veterans found a receptive culture. The exchange went both ways. The miners and administrators of Cydonia gave the veterans context for understanding what they'd been fighting for and what they hadn't, and the veterans gave the colony a connection to the broader history of what the settled systems had just been through. This is one of the ways that catastrophic events propagate their consequences through populations over time, not only through the direct experience of destruction and loss, but through the secondary transmission of understanding, people carrying the knowledge of what institutions are capable of, what they're willing to sacrifice, where their genuine priorities actually lie. That knowledge has a half-life much longer than the events that produced it. The peace that followed the colony war did not arrive in Cydonia as relief. It arrived as an administrative event, a change in the directives coming down from UC governance, a gradual normalization of the supply lines, a return of personnel, and attention to the routine work of colonial management. The transition from wartime extraction to peacetime extraction was less dramatic than it sounds. The fundamental conditions of the colony's existence did not change because a treaty had been signed in a room that none of the miners had been invited to. The war itself ended on terms that were, for the UC, humiliating in ways that the official language of the armistice was careful not to dwell on. The Battle of Cheyenne in 2311 had gone badly. A civilian Freestar fleet using hit-and-run tactics had crippled the UC Navy's major vessels, and the Freestar Collective had effectively won the conflict by making the cost of continuing it too high to bear. The peace that followed, the armistice, required the UC to accept an outlawing of the xenoweapons and mech warfare it had deployed, and to submit 3 of its senior officers to trial for war crimes. It was the peace of a power that had been forced to terms, dressed in the language of mutual recovery. What changed for Cydonia was the framing. The UC's post-war communications emphasized collective sacrifice and shared resilience. This language arrived in Cydonia and was received with the particular quality of attention that Cydonian culture reserves for official language, polite, silent, and entirely skeptical. Cydonia came through the colony war intact in the physical sense. The infrastructure was more damaged by deferred maintenance than by direct conflict. The population had contracted somewhat as people left for other opportunities during and after the war, and not all of them came back. But the colony was still there. The mines were still producing. The dome was still standing, intact but changed, intact but carrying something that it hadn't carried before. The years after the colony war were a period of reconstruction across the settled systems. Not only physical reconstruction, but something harder to name, an attempt to reconstitute the social and institutional frameworks that the conflict had damaged. The UC pursued this with its characteristic combination of genuine ambition and administrative overconfidence, projecting stability and continuity while managing, quietly and imperfectly, a set of internal stresses that the war had exposed but not resolved. Cydonia's place in this reconstruction was what it had always been, a source of raw materials, a node in a supply chain, a population to be administered. The colony did not receive the kind of reinvestment that the wartime rhetoric of sacrifice and collective effort might have suggested it was owed. It received what the mathematics allowed, which was marginally more than before, and still less than what the people living there might have considered fair. They continued anyway. Because continuing is what Cydonia does, there is a specific quality to places that survive things they shouldn't have survived, a kind of density, as if the accumulated weight of what they've been through has compressed the air slightly, made the surfaces harder, slowed time down just a fraction. You feel it when you walk through them. Something in the environment tells you that you are not in a place with a recent history. Cydonia has that quality. When you encounter the colony in the present of the settled systems, more than 3 centuries after the first pressurized dome was sealed on Martian rock, what strikes you is not its decline exactly. Cydonia has been in various stages of uncertain sustainability for most of its existence. The condition you find it in is not dramatically worse than the condition it's been in for most of its history. But there is a particular note of exhaustion in it, the exhaustion of a place that has been continuously asked to produce without being proportionally sustained for so long that the asking has become the ambient condition of existence. The mining operations continue. The veins have not run out. There is iron in the Martian subsurface in quantities that make the colony's total extraction to date look modest. By 2330, Sol itself is widely regarded as a backwater by the rest of the settled systems, a place inhabited by miners and spacers and people who, for one reason or another, have not made it out. Cydonia wears this reputation without embarrassment. The rest of the galaxy has moved on. The ore still ships. The equipment is old in some places and very old in others, maintained with the kind of determined ingenuity that develops in places where replacement parts are expensive and downtime is not an option. The miners who work the current operations are descended, in some cases, literally, from the people who worked the first ones. The techniques have improved. The culture has not changed as much as the techniques. What you notice when you talk to people in Cydonia, at the Broken Spear, in the corridors, in the administrative areas where Governor Glenn Hurst's office oversees the colony's relationship with UC authority, is that they are not performing anything for you. There is no civic pride routine, no official narrative about the glory of the first colony, no effort to make you feel that Cydonia is something other than what it is. If anything, there is a mild impatience with the symbolic weight that visitors sometimes bring to the place, the tendency to look at Cydonia and see a monument when what the people who live there see is a home. This is one of the colony's most enduring characteristics, a deep resistance to its own mythology. Cydonia knows what it is. The rest of the settled systems has elaborate feelings about what Cydonia means. The first colony, the origin point, the cradle of human expansion. The people inside the colony have no particular investment in any of those framings. They know what it costs to keep the lights on. They know what the quarterly production reports say. They know which corridors flood during certain atmospheric conditions and which sections of the mine have rock that has been weakening for years without the resources available for proper remediation. The gap between the symbol and the reality is not a source of bitterness for them exactly. It is more like background noise, omnipresent, uninteresting, not worth discussing with outsiders who wouldn't understand anyway. The characters you meet in Cydonia carry this quality in different ways. The miners who have spent 20 or 30 years working the underground operations have a specific kind of physical presence, economical in their movements, precise in their assessments, not given to wasted words or wasted effort. They have the look of people who have learned to conserve everything: energy, speech, patience, not because they are cold, but because conservation is what the environment trained them toward. When one of them tells you something, it's because it's worth saying. That directness can feel abrupt until you understand that it is, in its way, a form of respect. The assumption that you don't need things softened or padded, that you can handle the actual content of what someone is trying to tell you. The administrators who manage the colony's relationship with UC authority navigate a set of competing demands with the weary fluency of people who have been navigating those same competing demands in various forms for their entire working lives. They live in the gap between what the UC expects from Cydonia and what Cydonia is actually capable of delivering, translating in both directions, absorbing the friction of the mismatch. It is unglamorous work. It requires a particular kind of talent for diplomacy without servility, for honesty within constraint, for keeping machines running that are too important to let fail and too underfunded to run cleanly. The best of them are extraordinary people whose names will not appear in any history that the UC compiles about the settled systems. Even the people passing through, traders, travelers, UC personnel on temporary assignment, tend to absorb something of the colony's register within a short time. The place has a way of imposing its own tempo, the artificial lighting that never quite mimics daylight, the background hum of life support that you eventually stop hearing consciously, but that never fully disappears, the way conversations tend toward the concrete and the practical, rather than the speculative. All of these work on you, gradually, until the rhythms of the colony feel less like something you are visiting and more like something you are inside. There are young people in Cydonia who were born here and are deciding, in the way that young people decide things, whether to stay or go. The settled systems offers opportunities that Mars cannot, and the pull of elsewhere is real for anyone who has grown up inside the same tunnels, under the same dome, breathing air manufactured by the same systems their parents and grandparents breathed. Some of them leave and come back. Some of them find, when they've seen enough of what else is out there, that Cydonia is actually what they wanted all along, that the specific gravity of the place, its particular combination of difficulty and community, and the particular pride that comes from having stayed and done the work, is something that other places don't offer and can't replicate. The ones who come back arrive with something the colony needs and rarely gets: a comparison point. The knowledge that it could be different, that other arrangements are possible, that the specific conditions of Cydonian life are not the inevitable conditions of all life. Whether that knowledge generates frustration or acceptance or something more creative varies by person. But it is a kind of wealth that doesn't show up in any production report. There are also people in Cydonia who have come from elsewhere in the settled systems and chosen deliberately to be here, drawn by the work, by the reputation, by the specific culture that centuries of difficult conditions have produced. They come knowing what they are getting into, or at least knowing the outline of it, and their presence is a small but persistent testament to the fact that Cydonia produces something that can't be extracted or shipped. It produces a way of being in the world that some people find more valuable than comfort. The broken spear is where most of these lives converge, at least partially. It is easy to dismiss a bar as incidental to the history of a place, but that would be wrong. The broken spear is the closest thing Cydonia has to a public square, the space where the colony's dispersed population gathers and, simply by being in the same room, reconstitutes itself as a community. The conversations that happen there are not always important, Much of it is the ordinary business of people sharing space and time and the particular intimacy of having survived the same difficult week. But occasionally, something matters. Information travels. Decisions get made. The shape of a problem becomes visible when it is described out loud to someone who doesn't already know the solution. The bar is where Cydonia thinks collectively, in the informal and unplanned way that most genuine thinking actually happens. Step back from Cydonia far enough to see its entire shape, and something interesting comes into view. Every major characteristic of the colony, its underground architecture, its mining-centered economy, its relationship of functional antagonism with the UC, its deep skepticism of institutional language, its resistance to its own mythology, the specific culture of directness and endurance that it produced. All of these were the outcomes of conditions that nobody planned. The people who established Cydonia were not trying to create a particular kind of culture. They were trying to survive. The culture emerged from the survival, not from any vision of what a colony should be. This matters because it tells us something about how human societies actually form, as opposed to how they are described in the official accounts. The UC's founding documents, written decades after Cydonia already existed, are full of language about the deliberate cultivation of civic values, the principled extension of human civilization, the careful construction of governance frameworks that would serve colonial populations well. And those intentions were real, at least in part. But Cydonia predated all of it. It was already there, already shaped, already carrying its particular character before any of those documents were drafted. What Cydonia actually became was the product of material conditions, economic imperatives, geological facts, and the accumulated choices of individual people responding to circumstances that outran any central plan, a plan that, in the colony's earliest decades, didn't yet exist. The first colony is, in this sense, not an advertisement for human ambition. It is a more honest document. It shows what happens when people are placed in conditions of genuine difficulty and left to work out, with inadequate resources and imperfect information and all the friction of actual human beings trying to live alongside each other, what survival requires. The result is not elegant. It is not inspiring in the way that origin myths tend to be. But it is real, and it has lasted, and the things it produced, the culture, the community, the particular kind of human being that Cydonia tends to make, have a quality to them that the cleaner narratives don't. This is what gets lost when Cydonia gets absorbed into the founding mythology of the settled systems. The mythologized version preserves the symbol and discards the substance. It takes the fact of the colony's existence and removes from it everything that made that existence difficult: the inadequacy of resources, the condescension of distant governance, the grinding economics of marginally viable extraction, the individual lives spent in conditions that fell consistently short of what the people living them deserved. What's left is a clean origin point, useful for speeches and commemorations, emptied of the friction that made it true. The actual Cydonia, the one made of cold rock and recycled air and people who stayed when they could have left, carries something that the mythologized version doesn't. It carries proof that human civilization, at its most fundamental level, is built not on ambition, but on endurance. Not on the dramatic act of going somewhere new, but on the quiet, largely unwitnessed act of staying and continuing to build something after the drama has faded, and what remains is just the work. The UC's relationship with Cydonia is, in microcosm, the relationship it has with all of its colonial populations. And understanding that relationship is essential to understanding the fault lines that run through the settled systems in the present. But the relationship between Deimos Staryards and Cydonia may be the more revealing template. The corporation that owns the mining operations, that has relied almost entirely on Cydonian ore for its shipbuilding since the colony was established, and that still runs production in 2330. That relationship has outlasted every political arrangement the colony has been subject to. Governments change. Corporate supply chains, it turns out, are more durable. The patterns this established, the extraction of resources and the rationing of investment, the management of populations whose lived experience diverged increasingly from official narratives, the treatment of colonial identity as a logistical variable, were not invented by the UC. They were already running when the UC arrived. These patterns were not invented deliberately. They emerged from the same kind of material logic that produced Cydonia's culture, but they were nevertheless choices, made again and again at each point where a different choice was available. What the Colony War ultimately revealed, and what Cydonia, in its quieter, earlier way, had been demonstrating for generations, is that populations governed this way do not simply accept their conditions indefinitely. They adapt, they endure, they find ways to live within structures they cannot change. But they also remember. They accumulate an account of what they were owed and what they received, and that account doesn't disappear when the immediate pressures ease. It waits. Cydonia has been waiting in its particular patient way for a very long time. The question we arrived with, what Cydonia's founding actually revealed about humanity, has transformed by now into something more precise. It isn't really a question about ambition versus survival, or about the gap between what civilizations say they value and what they actually do. Those things are real, but they are descriptions of a condition rather than an understanding of it. The deeper question, the one that Cydonia keeps posing to anyone willing to sit with it long enough, is about what it means to build something under conditions that make building difficult. Every society likes to believe that its foundation was heroic. The first colonists were brave. They were. But bravery is not what built Cydonia. Bravery got people onto the ships. What built the colony was something slower and harder to celebrate. The willingness to wake up in a tunnel on a cold red planet and do the work again, knowing that the work would continue tomorrow and the day after, knowing that the resources were insufficient and the recognition was absent, and the official narrative assigned the heroism elsewhere. To do it anyway, to keep the machinery running, to raise children in a place that required them to be tougher than children should have to be, to build a community out of shared difficulty and call it home. This is a kind of humanity that the settled system's official histories tend to acknowledge in passing and then move past. It doesn't make for good commemorations. There is no clean moment to point to, no singular act to honor. It is distributed across thousands of lives, expressed in small decisions and daily endurances that are invisible individually and monumental in aggregate. What Cydonia is, finally, is a record, not of humanity's triumph, but of humanity's persistence. The difference is significant. Triumph implies a conclusion, a moment where the struggle resolves into achievement. Persistence is ongoing. It doesn't have a conclusion. It just continues, day after day, generating the conditions for everything else, for the United Colonies, for the settled systems, for every civilization and conflict and discovery that followed, while receiving less credit for that generation than it deserves. The colony is still there. The tunnels are still being worked. The air is still being recycled. The dome still stands against the Martian sky. People are alive inside it right now who were born there and will die there, who have lived their whole lives in the space between those rock walls and whose existence is as legitimate and as valuable and as human as anything produced by the more storied parts of the galaxy. There is something in Cydonia that the rest of the settled systems needs and has consistently failed to fully reckon with. The knowledge that civilization is not made in the moments of expansion and triumph. It is made in the years of maintenance, in the work that nobody photographs, in the keeping going that is the actual substance of what historical grandeur is built on top of. Cydonia asked humanity a question when it was founded, and that question is still open. Not what are we capable of reaching for. We know the answer to that, and it's impressive. The real question is what we're willing to do for the people who make the reaching possible. What we owe the ones who stayed underground so the civilization above could grow. The colony endures. The question endures with it. There is more in this archive. There always is. Come back when you're ready. We'll go deeper.